Hello, everybody in the vinyl community. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you guys are all doing well. My name is Craig. Well, I've been out watching YouTube videos of other people in the vinyl community out there and what they're doing compared to what I do. And I've kind of decided to change it up just a little bit. This show, when I first started, I thought, oh, it'll just be like a podcast about music and about my records. And um, I've decided to change it up just a little bit. Uh, got some different things going on here, and I thought I would just kind of treat the show a little bit different. And I know, YouTube is like, oh, you shouldn't be talking like the way I'm talking now. You want to get clicks and views or whatever. Well, I don't care about any of that. I just want to share my record collection with other people out there, just like you guys who are doing the same thing. And some of the guys I see out there in the vinyl community doing the same thing, and I was looking at formats and all the different things that go with it. And I decided, screw it, I'm just going to basically do what I want, which is kind of what I've always been doing. But I've been trying to like, oh, let's be polished and let's do this and let's do that. And you'll see I've drop the intro from the show and things like that. And I may still throw my little logo I made up. I did spend time doing it, but I don't think it's really necessary. I'm not trying to brand myself or anything else. I'm not going to change the name of the show. It's still going to be The Spirit of Vinyl or whatever. So anyway, it's kind of what's going on. Things will be, who knows what's going to happen or how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do this one here today. I want to talk about debut albums from the 1980s, from the what we would call hair metal now, what we just called metal back in the day. I just want to share some of those albums, some of my favorites that are in my collection. I'll talk about that in just a second here. So, you'll notice things are a little bit different here nowadays and less professional, maybe. As you can see, whatever, doesn't really matter. I'm having fun. If you guys are enjoying it as we're watching it, that's all that matters. All right, so I was thinking the other day about the debut albums in the 1980s and how many great debut albums we had in the 1980s of all of these bands and people that came out with these records that are iconic, that started careers and sold millions of copies. I feel like the 80s is the decade where that happened probably more than any other decade in the past or even since then, honestly. Of course, nobody sells records nowadays the way they used to. So, but I don't know if there's an impact of as much as it was when the first whatever album comes out, if there's as much of a societal impact as there was back in the 80s. So I went through my 80s section of, I'm strictly going with like what we would call hair metal or whatever. I'm not talking about the thrash music or anything else of the 80s or the pop or anything else. Basically just metal. So, and if you look at it, and I'm going to go with this first one, even though it's not the debut of the person, Ozzy Osbourne, Blizzard of Oz, 1981. This one's a Japanese pressing from 1981. This introduces us to Ozzy as a solo artist and his band, I guess you'd call it at the time. I don't know if we consider it a debut album because he was with Black Sabbath all those years, but this came out in 81 and it kind of, if you think about it, I know, when it comes to this style of music, Quiet Riot gets a lot of credit because of Mental Health, but that's not their debut album, so we won't be discussing them at all. So this is a debut. I'm going to call it a debut. So Ozzy, Blizzard of Oz. Then 81, 82, a band from the Sunset Strip comes out. They do not break big with this debut album, but as you go back in time and listen to it, Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love. This is 81 or 82 is when this album came out, depending on what you look at. The Leather Records version is from 1981, and then the Elektra version comes out in 82. This is an '08 repress. I love this album. To me, Motley Crue, when they first came out, this sound is kind of got some punk mixed in with it, and it's a lot heavier and more raw. It's got Piece of Your Action, Too Fast for Love, all these great songs on it. This album is great. Just like that Blizzard of Oz album, every song on there is killer. This is pretty much the same way. Such a killer debut. Early 80s, starting to set the trend of what's going to be happening in the Sunset Strip. I think all that starts with Motley Crue, honestly, by putting this record out on their own and then being picked up. Then we're going to go basically same year. 1982, on the other side of the United States, on the West Coast, we have Twisted Sister Under the Blade. Now, this album was originally released in 82, mostly in England. Twisted Sister didn't get big in the United States until Stay Hungry came out, so these albums were from Europe. I think this is a killer album. Songs Under the Blade, Tear It Loose, Destroyer, I'll Never Grow Up, Bad Boys of Rock and Roll, Run for Your Life. All those are great songs. I don't know if this gets the credit it deserves as much as like Stay Hungry. A lot of people with Twisted Sister, especially in the 80s, if you were just a casual fan, you didn't really know this. You listen to Stay Hungry and you listen to the one that came out afterwards or whatever, and then Twisted Sister kind of disappears. But they have lots of great music. This debut album is a killer debut album from the 80s. I thought I'd have to put that in this list. So I know it didn't sell millions of copies. None of these really did yet, anyway. The Wizard album did very well, but now we're going to go on to, this is Ronnie James Dio's Holy Diver. Like the Ozzy album, it's not the debut of Ronnie James Dio, but is the debut of Dio as a band. This is classic. I consider this a debut album because it's Dio as a band, not Dio in Rainbow or in Elf or in Black Sabbath. We all knew who Dio was, just like we all knew who Ozzy was. But when they go solo or with a new band, I feel this is a debut album. And this is a killer debut album, one of the greatest 80s metal albums of all time anyway. So I think that belongs on this list of great debuts. And that album came out in 83. So we're starting to move through the decades. And early, mid to 80s, 1984, this album comes out. And this album was a hit right away. I Want to Be Somebody video hits MTV. This is, Wasp, I Want to Be Somebody, Love Machine, and Hellion, and Sleeping in the Fire. And I mean, this is a killer album right here, guys. I think this one did sell well and kind of catapult to the top. This is one of those 80s records that got immediate attention, seemingly immediate attention. So Wasp, one of the greats. Same year, 1984. Oh, by the way, that Wasp is a 2012 version. 1984, Rat Out of the Cellar comes out. This is a Japanese press from 1984. Killer debut album from Rat. Round and Round. The second I saw the video on MTV, and I discovered all these bands. Same with Wasp and Dio. I discovered all these bands. 84. I'm 15 years old. I see the video for Out of the Cellar on a Thursday night or whatever when I'm watching MTV, and that weekend I went out and bought this record. Not this actual record. This is one of the ones I've replaced since time's gone on with this Japanese pressing. I had that on vinyl, original pressing from high school. And when I found my records, I've told that story in the earlier episodes, when I found those records when we moved, the Rat records weren't in there. Neither were my Motley Crue records, whatever. All my Kiss stuff was still there, things like that. But I don't know what happened to my original copy of Too Fast for Love or Shout at the Devil or whatever. Same with this right here. Next up, Queensryche, 1984, The Warning. This album is killer prog type metal. It's got Warning and Enforce and Deliverance and Take Hold of the Flame, Road to Madness. This is a great album. This is the same way I discovered this band on MTV. I saw the video for The Warning with Queensryche up there rocking out. It was filmed in Japan, and they had, basically sold out crowd. I'd never even heard of this band. And this was one of those, once I saw it, I went to the record store and I bought it. I had this on vinyl also as a teenager. I don't have that OG vinyl. This is an OG vinyl from 1984, but this is not the same copy I had when I was a teenager. I've replaced this as an adult recently within the last year or so. Another killer album from now we're moving on to like 1986. This right here, Cinderella Night Songs. Man, this is a great album. This is some of the greatest blues metal type thing I've ever heard, honestly. Night Songs, Shake Me, Nobody's Fool. Those songs were all hits, and just the look is hair metal, but the sound was not. And I feel like Cinderella got super popular super fast. This is a great debut album from 1986. This is a 2021 repress. Here's another one. This is a repress, and this is an album I didn't really get into till later, 1986, Faster Pussycat. This is a 2016 repress, Rhino Records. I just got this probably 7 or 8 months ago. I saw it at a flea market. The guy was wanting like $60 for it. I went on Discogs and looked at, sales, and I told him I'd give him like 40 and he took it. So, and it was in mint condition essentially. It had been opened. I don't know if it had ever been played, but this album is great. Bathroom Wall, Don't Change That Song, Cat House, Shooting You Down. I mean, this is a killer record that I wasn't into at the time when it came out back in 1986. I wasn't into this. I saw Faster Pussycat open for Ace Frehley back at this time when they were on this tour, and I didn't know who they were. I was there to see Ace Frehley, being a Kiss fan, obviously. I was there to see Ace, and I saw this band open up for Ace, and I thought they were really, really good. They had a great sound. It was that Sunset Strip sound. It was starting to, become a little more sleazier than it was like with Rat and Poison and stuff. Then this is really sleazy 80s rock. It's a great sound. They were a great band. Probably should have gone a lot farther. But part of the problem, what happens with Faster Pussycat, is what happens a year later is this band comes out. And this album comes out in 1986. This is a 2018 repress with all kinds of multiple stuff. And, I don't know if you've all seen this out there. I'm not opening and going through all of this. This is a pretty cool one. It's got side fours like laser etched with a logo and everything else. And this is probably the greatest debut album almost of all time. I'd put this right up there with Van Halen 1 and everything else. It is definitely the greatest debut album of the 80s, in my opinion. All the other ones we've talked about are all great albums, but nothing compares to this. I mean, we all know the effect that Appetite for Destruction had on pop culture and had on us as teenagers at the time, and what Axl and Slash and Duff and Steven and Izzy were doing was beyond. And I think due to what they were doing and what happened, that's why bands like Faster Pussycat and stuff like that got a little bit of recognition, but they also kind of got left in the fray because Guns N' Roses was doing it so well. It's the same thing with this next album from '88. This album is just as good as Appetite for Destruction. This is a great album of that era, 1988, late 80s. This album comes out. This album is killer all the way through and through. It's got all these great songs on it. No Mercy, Sex Action, Electric Gypsy, One More Reason, Bitches Back, Hollywood Tea, Shoot for Thrills, Down in the City. I mean, this is a killer LA Sunset Strip album, And that time, we're getting Faster Pussycat and Guns N' Roses and LA Guns and all this stuff coming out of the West Coast. This is a killer record. I always loved this album. I saw LA Guns. I've seen them multiple times. I, told the story about talking to Stephen Riley one time back in the day. But this is one of my favorites. Even though I can't admit, obviously, sales-wise and everything else, that Appetite is the greatest album of the 80s, especially when it comes to debuts. I got to put that LA Guns album right up there at the top. And finally, kind of to round out the decade, 1989, we get this killer debut from Skid Row. East Coast, New Jersey, I guess you could call it hair metal. Big Guns, Sweet Little Sister, 18 and Life, Rattlesnake Shake, Youth Gone Wild. It was a lot heavier than what we would have considered hair metal at the time or whatever. But Sebastian was so pretty, and with the nice hair and the ballads and everything else, they had the formula and everything else. So those are some of the debut albums that came out in the 80s. And I know there's a lot more, and I have honorable mentions of, albums I like, Madam X, and, Tesla put out their debut album in the 80s and everything else. And, but to me, these great ones that that I just pulled out of here are different than some of those other ones. The Fairlace Comet debut is a great album, and you had the one hit type wonder bands that came out in the 80s, like Keel and Loudness and stuff like that, that came out and had pretty good debuts, but I don't know if you would call them great, and all kinds of musicians that used to be in other bands, Vinnie Vincent Invasion, and then Slaughter comes out in the 80s from that and everything else, and it just kind of moves around, and ultimately I think that was a downfall of what that music was. It became too saturated. We had all these great albums throughout the decade, and then everybody was trying to do that, and I think that's ultimately what killed it. A lot of people like to blame grunge for killing that 80s type metal, but I don't believe that's it. I mean, yeah, taste change and so on, but it was killing itself by just rehashing and repackaging the same thing over and over. You can only have so many bands with 3 brunettes, 1 blonde, do 4 songs, make sure there's a ballad in there, make sure the girls like him, make sure they dress this way. You can only do so much of that before it starts to go away. So, but overall, I think those are some of the greatest 80s debut albums of all time. And I do believe that the 80s decade, and I know a lot of it has to do with us coming of age in that time frame or whatever, but even if you just look at like sales and impact on society and so on, honestly, I think the 80s had a larger impact when it came to music of bands and their debut albums and how great they all were and how we still love all those albums of the first albums, and some of the great bands like the 70s and stuff like that, they came out, they didn't hit big on their first albums. They didn't have these great debuts, they have great albums, but like even with Kiss, their debut album didn't get any traction until later. Journey, they had debut albums, they didn't get any traction until Steve Perry joined the band later. So, but bands like Wasp and Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses and LA Guns and, Rat and all that, they all jump off on that debut album and become popular off of that debut album. And that's why I think the 80s, when it came to debut albums, when it came to rock and metal, was the far superior decade. Not just because I was in high school at the time and everything else. So, what do you guys think? What are some of your favorite debut albums? So go out there and go through your collection, and it doesn't have to be the same genre I'm talking about. You got other great debut albums, of that decade you'd like to talk about. And, there's all the thrash and everything else that came out that are killer debut albums, but I wanted to stick more with the hair type metal. I'm not sure what we call it hair metal now. Back then it was just metal. And, there's some talk out there about how hair metal is considered disparaging or whatever, but I've embraced it. And it is what it is, and that's what it's called. It's just like, they weren't calling grunge when grunge came out. We weren't calling hair metal when hair metal came out. So, but yeah, what are some of your favorites out of the list I did, or do your own, and I'll put a link or whatever, and we'll talk. All right. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate the vinyl community out there watching and sharing their knowledge with me, and I'm going to try to do my best to do the same thing. I will talk to you all at a later date. Have a good night, guys.